Hello all, thank you all for joining us today at the Atlantic Council with the Syria project on a panel on how the United States can counter normalization of the Assad regime in the region. I want to welcome you all online and in person here. As we all know, earlier this year, many countries in the Middle East and the Arab League welcomed back the Assad regime back into the Arab League, opening kind of like a new phase in the region where the Assad regime had opened doors across the region, foregoing the crimes that his regime and his army and his government has been committing for over 12 years against his own people in Syria. How would this put the United States, its interests, its counter-ISIS mission, its relationships with the region, and the global power competition with China and Russia overall? We are very honored to be accompanied by Representative Joe Wilson, the chairman of the subcommittee for the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, to tell us more about how the United States can work against normalization in the region and the work that the House Foreign Relations Subcommittee on MENA and Central Asia has been doing to achieve that. Welcome, Congressman. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And indeed, I want to thank everyone for having me here today. Also want to thank all efforts of Free Syria. It's so important, a country that has been so important in the Middle East, a country that, from my perspective, we have a very significant Syrian American community that has just been vital. And we know how talented the people of Syria are and how sad it is, the oppression of the Assad regime. And every effort should be made for the freedom and liberty of the people of Syria. And that's why I'm glad to be here today. And I do have an opening statement I'd like to make because so many points need to be stated and correctly. And indeed, this is a timely discussion, sadly, because the mass murderer and dictator Bashar al-Assad should be accountable for his atrocities against the people of Syria. It's important to remember the brutal response to the 2011 Syrian revolution by the Assad regime that was in response to the peaceful pro-democracy demonstrations by the Syrian people who were tired of the corruption and unchecked 40-year reign of the Assad family. As we know, what followed constitutes some of the worst war crimes perpetrated in modern history. If not for the backing of war criminal Putin and the regime in Tehran, other dictatorships, the Assad regime would have been unable to perpetrate genocide against the Syrian people to the extent that it has. Over 500,000 Syrians have been murdered, and over 12 million Syrians have been forced to flee their homes, jobs, and communities and families. We are now in a situation where our partners that we appreciate so much in the Gulf and beyond are unimaginably engaging and normalizing the relationship with dictator Assad, though to what end it's unclear, since Assad, like war criminal Putin and the regime in Tehran, adhere to no agreements. Assad's participation in the Arab League summit, I believe, was disgusting, and just yesterday, sadly, the extraordinary country of Turkey, led by President Erdogan, has now said he's open to meeting with Assad. Again, a NATO country that is so important for peace and security in the Middle East. I'm just really hopeful that Turkey does better than just meet. In response to the growing trend of normalization with the Assad regime, I am grateful that we have a bipartisan legislation, the Assad Regime Anti-Normalization Act of 2023. And I want to commend my Democrat colleagues, Congressman Steve Cohen, Brendan Boyle of Philadelphia, Congressman Gonzalez. It's a bipartisan legislation. And one of the ironies really of the conduct of the dictator Putin and now the dictator Assad and the dictator Xi has been to unify Republicans and Democrats to oppose the dictatorships around the world that are rule of gun, opposing democracy's rule of law. It really is refreshing. I wish I could tell you we had other items of bipartisan cooperation. We don't. It's unified, though, that we are standing up for democracies against dictatorships. A bill has been endorsed by President Obama's envoy to Syria and ambassador for war crimes, and President Donald Trump's envoys to Syria. And it brings Republicans and Democrats together. With the help of those who've lost loved ones, including infants, to the Assad regime's brutality, we won't stop until there's a free and democratic Syria. There is no solution to the conflict in Syria so long as Assad remains in power, and any attempts to rehabilitate Assad are unrealistic and doomed to fail. How many more Syrians have to be killed until the world take action? We are in a global conflict of democracy with rule of law versus dictators with rule of gun. The conflict was launched by war criminal Putin, and this is solely Putin's war. Only he can stop it and end it immediately, and we need to have in Ukraine, just as we do in Syria, territorial integrity. With that in mind, what's happened in Aleppo, sadly, was a trial run for Putin to repeat the atrocities in the Ukrainian cities like Bucha, which I have visited, and how horrible Mariupol and Bakhmut, which sadly we need to all address. The horrors inflicted upon the people of Syria are repeated in Ukraine, with Putin's forces relentlessly bombing and targeting civilian infrastructure and humanitarian aid. The legislation that we have is very simple. If you support Assad, there are consequences because we value our allies and partners in the region, but we think that going down the wrong path of engaging with a criminal regime is not possible. This bill makes it very difficult for businessmen in the Gulf to work with Assad by requiring enforcement through annual reports of funds of more than $500,000 that go into Syria from Turkey and the Arab countries. The bill has also updated provisions regarding the protections for humanitarian organizations and extends the Caesar sunset to 2023. We all address the legislative and legitimate question of whether this bill hurts humanitarian aid. That's a concern. But that's a lie, because it pushed mainly by those who never supported sanctions against Assad in the first place. The reason why aid cannot enter Syria is that the Assad regime is stealing it. The United Nations has directly provided billions of dollars in aid to dictator Assad, but when the earthquake struck last year, the UN refused to cross the border during the recent earthquake to provide aid to those who needed it because the criminal Assad told them not to. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for the hearing today, and most of all, thank you to the Syrian organizations around the world for their tremendous efforts in support of this legislation. In particular, the broad coalition of Syrian organizations such as White Helmets, the American Coalition for Syria, Citizens for Safe and Secure America, the Syrian Emergency Task Force for their support of the legislation. And I hope that Congress will act quickly, and I was very glad to hear that Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Richard Durbin, again bipartisan, are offering legislation in the U.S. Senate. And we will not forget the people of Syria.
Thank you so much, Congressman. You mentioned, which is very important, the Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act, with its 4 pillars. One, basically extending the Caesar Act until 2032, prohibiting any U.S. government official or the U.S. government from normalizing or recognizing any government led by Assad or involves Bashar al-Assad. Includes going after aid diversion in Syria, and also like organizations that help in aid diversion, like the Syria Trust for Development that is run by Asma al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's wife. I think for many in Washington and outside Washington wonder, why does the United States need to worry about normalization in the region? Why do we need to do something there?
Well, my view is normalization really is surrender, appeasement to a dictatorship that has so gruesomely, as I mentioned, the millions of people affected in Syria. I've actually been to a refugee camp in Jordan, and Jordan has been so remarkably helpful. But to visit the camp, and it was sad but impressive to me to see the thousands of people there. And we know Turkey too has also accepted, and I've met with the ambassador to thank them for what they've done. And so different countries, but for millions of people to have to flee their homes. This is just inconceivable. But what was really encouraging, visiting the refugee camp in Jordan, I've been to a lot of refugee camps around the world, but I've never seen one so well organized. And it was well organized because the people who have fled organized it. And it was actually inspiring to see the schools, to see almost a normal life in a very bizarre circumstance of living in former TEUs. But it showed me that, gosh, once Assad is removed, a very vibrant country can be returned that has been so important in the Middle East.
100%. You mentioned also Aleppo and kind of like the example it set for Russia, I mean, especially in 2016, to do more in Crimea, Ukraine today. Why do you think, or how do you think countering Assad normalization would help us in our kind of like competition with Russia and China in the region?
Well, it's just horrifying to think of. I'm really grateful. I've got a 31-year service in the Army National Guard. I'm really grateful. My oldest son served in Iraq. My second son, field artillery. My second son was a doctor in Iraq. My third son served Bright Star in Egypt. My youngest was a engineer in Afghanistan. So military service is very important to me. But what we're facing, sadly, using Putin tactics of total destruction, it's just, we need to make every effort that this never occurred again. And we can see large cities, Mariupol, Bakhmut, where total devastation and targeting of civilians. And it was a lesson that we should have learned from Aleppo. And every time now we have discussions on the worldwide conflict we have between democracies with rule of law and dictatorships with rule of gun, I make every effort I can to point out, hey, this didn't begin on February 24th, 2021, when 2022, when Putin invaded Ukraine. It actually, the devastation was Aleppo initially, and the world needs to see. And these are war crimes, and there should be prosecution at some time, International Court of Criminal Justice, and and it should be documented. And incredibly enough, we have something that in conflict that's never occurred before. And that is that we can document war crimes now. And any citizen with their cell phone can document a crime being committed and date, time, place, and then actually even identify the individuals conducting the war crimes. We can, through facial recognition, and then hopefully in court someday, we'll also be able to find the chain of command. And so people who are committing war crimes, whether they are for Putin or Assad or Xi or for Tehran, they're going to be identified. And so it's up for a civilized world to come together, and we are. I've never seen such unity. I mentioned we have the unity of Republicans and Democrats, and then with the Putin's war in Ukraine, we have unprecedented unity of the European Union. All 27 countries coming together. And then NATO, who would ever imagine that you not only have unity, but Sweden has given up 200 years of neutrality to join NATO. That's stunning. And then Finland, with an 830-mile border with the Russian Federation, now part of NATO. And so, and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, I'm grateful to be the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe American delegation. And we just had our conference in Vancouver, Canada, and it was virtually unanimous, opposing dictatorships, which, and normally by this time, okay, it's called war fatigue. Well, actually, because of the courage of the people of Syria resisting and the courage of the people of Ukraine resisting, it's actually given encouragement around the world. And there's always going to be a bit of war fatigue, but it's not like anything we've ever had. There's more resolve, I think, than ever.
Absolutely. In terms of, you mentioned also, Tehran and the Iranian regime as
Yeah.
part of the messages we're trying to send. Earlier this year, we've seen more kind of like a stream of normalization across the region where different countries or powers are trying to at least turn down the temperature in terms of their disagreements. What message do you think? I mean, the message is clear from the legislation, the Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act, to countries in the region, but specifically to our, as you mentioned, Arab partners in the Gulf about normalization with the Assad regime. What messages have you been receiving from those countries regarding this legislation?
Well, I wish I could say it's very encouraging. It's been somewhat indecisive. And it's really sad to me because on my visits to the Persian Gulf countries, there's nothing more impressive than to see the economic development, the opportunities, the extraordinary successes of the different countries from Bahrain to Kuwait to Qatar to UAE, you name it. Gosh, their successes and we want the people of the Persian Gulf region to be successful, but I really think they're making a mistake to not recognize the danger of the Assad dictatorship, and they're going to find out, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that Assad's not going to live up to any agreements. We know Putin's had 9 different agreements relative to the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and they were all simply a pause in conflict. This is the same thing, and the isolation of the dictatorship is the best course, and I look forward in a very positive way, including Turkey too, to encourage isolation of a virtually, to me it's a cancer that can be addressed by isolation by what I perceive to be modern countries that have much to gain, mutually beneficial, of working together for democracy as opposed to dictatorships.
Absolutely. In terms of the, on the other hand, in terms of the messages that you would like or what you would like to see the Biden administration doing more about normalization, I think it's clear having this bipartisan support that, the issue of normalization is actually an issue of concern for both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill. So far, the resolution has almost 50 co-sponsors across the aisle. What, as lawmakers on the Hill, what would you like to see the Biden administration doing more in terms of normalization?
Well, I'm really very grateful for the Democrat co-sponsors we have, and I have met with virtually all of them to express to them who can, who have contacts within the administration, to make every effort to isolate. I was really grateful with the Trump administration. We would have direct communications of how important it was, and we all remember when the chemical weapons were used against the citizens of Syria, that in 5 minutes President Trump authorized an assault to stop the attack. And that's the kind of resolve we need from the Biden administration. And so we will continue to work in a bipartisan manner, but it would be very helpful for my Democrat colleagues to in addition to the legislation, to be working with their contacts within the White House.
Well, in terms of other than working with the administration or for the your Democrat colleagues to work with contacts in the White House, in terms of the bill itself, the bill outlines very specific asks, as we said, in terms of aid diversion, making sure that actually aid that is paid by taxpayers' money is being received by those who deserve it on the ground. In terms of extending the Caesar Act until 2032, how much support do you find in making sure this proposed legislation is actually going to pass on both the House and the Senate?
And you're so correct, citing the 2032, how important that is to extend. And then I think it's really very important too, the revelation of any funds exceeding $500,000.
Yes.
Gosh, that's very revealing. And I'm really pleased. That's somewhat of a low level. So that means that that should be very discouraging to business people who should be looking at the consequences of what they're doing and backing up a dictatorship. And I just see it as very positive, and I'm just, again, grateful. As you mentioned, we have over 50 co-sponsors already, which is somewhat remarkable for legislation. And I have to give credit to the Syrian people that their resolve, their defiance of dictatorship has encouraged people within America and across the world to work together to support a free Syria.
Congressman Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll take a short break before we get our next line of speakers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's my honor to be with you. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us today on how the United States can counter the Assad normalization in the region. I'm honored to be joined by Mohammed Ala Ghanem, the policy chief at the Syrian American Council and the American Coalition for Syria, and Charles Lister, the director of the Counterterrorism and Syria programs at the Middle East Institute. And I just want to remind you, if you have any questions, please go to askac.org. That is askac.org. Thank you so much again for joining us. I want to start with you, Mohammed, just to get directly into the conversation. As Representative Wilson mentioned, there has been the Anti-Assad Normalization Act on the Hill as an initiative by both Democrats and Republican lawmakers to push against normalization in the region. Your organization has been, and many Syrian American organizations has been pushing hardly for the U.S. lawmakers to actually stand against normalization. Why is this an issue of interest for Americans? Why should Americans care and focus about normalizing Assad regime in the region?
Well, first off, Khutaiba, thank you so much for having us. I think there are plenty of reasons why Americans should care about allowing someone to kill 1 million people using indiscriminate bombing, using barrel bombs, using chemical weapons, using internationally prescribed weapons, and then allowing this person, this dictator, Bashar al-Assad, to be welcomed again as if nothing had happened. And we all saw how having no consequences or introducing no consequences for those heinous crimes, for razing entire cities to the ground, for displacing half the population, for creating a massive global refugee crisis, we saw how the ramifications or the implications were not contained to Syria. You know, Crimea happened a few years after Syria happened, and now there's a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it's by the same backers of Bashar al-Assad regime. It's by Russia, and Russia is being supported with Iranian drones in Ukraine. So the same backers who were able to carry out frankly, genocide in Syria and realize that they were able to get away with it, I would say they thought to themselves, why not replicate that in Europe? And that's what happened. And we warned back in 2012 and 2013, 2014, we warned that that was going to happen and that Europe was going to be next and that Putin was not going to stop in Syria. And sadly, you know, that came to pass. So I think that should be extremely disconcerting to Americans. And in addition to that, as I said, a lot of international norms are being trampled or have been trampled upon in Syria, and that's definitely not in national interest. You also have the rise of ISIS that my colleague Charles maybe can speak to. So you have the rise of ISIS. You have the global refugee crisis. You have so much a vortex of instability, and that's definitely not in the U.S. national interest.
So in a way, basically, if we would have done the right investment in Syria for like an average American, we wouldn't have been spending billions of dollars today in Ukraine.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Charles, I want to get to you. Also, I mean, looking at how the U.S. should perceive normalization, and we'll move like after that on what could be done better to actually counter normalization of the Assad regime. How do you see, other than basically, you know, preventing Russia from what it is doing in Ukraine today, how would normalization today, how does the normalization impact U.S. regional interest? Not only in terms of the counter-ISIS mission, but also in terms of Captagon trade and other issues related to national security.
Sure, thank you so much. So I'll echo Hamid's opening and say thank you, Qutaiba, for arranging this important event. I think the timing is crucially important. Obviously, the issue is a deeply frustrating one, but these discussions, you know, have to be had. I think to answer your question, I have to begin by questioning why the normalization itself is happening in the region. Why has the region taken the steps that it did? Why did the Saudis do such a sort of you know, consequential 180-degree shift just 2 or 3 years ago? And it is, whether we like it or not, because there is a widespread perception in the region that the United States is not withdrawing, but it's disengaging. Its interest is elsewhere. Its investments are moving elsewhere, and the region feels like it's been abandoned to deal with crises like Syria by itself. That's not to say that they're dealing with it in the right way, but that's why they have made this decision. They make no secret of that. At the same time, within the Biden administration, I've heard from several regional governments who recently were in town meeting with the administration. Senior officials have taken in the National Security Council to start repeating the same phrase, which is that to laud the administration's role in achieving the most stable Middle East we've seen in 25 years. That framework, that kind of perception within the Biden administration should be read through the lens as to, you know, why Middle East states are re-engaging with the regime. There is this very cold, hard realism within the administration, which is that the Middle East isn't fixable. This is not my words, this is them. The Middle East crises are not fixable. It's not our interest. We're not the world's policemen to try to fix them either. We'll allow the region to fix their crises themselves, no matter what steps have to be taken to do so. We don't have to be involved, which is the language from the administration. We're not normalizing, but it's not our business if others give it a try. So that's basically the framework that I think explains why we've seen what we've seen over the last few months. But in terms specifically of your question, I jotted down a few notes on my way here. Slightly worried I was going to miss the beginning of the panel, but the checklist of how has the normalization gone since it began in March and April this year is horrendous. Inflation, the Syrian pound has lost 50% of its value in the last 3 months since the Saudi foreign minister took the step to meet Assad. It's gone from 7,500 to a single US dollar to nearly 11,300 3 months later. That is a catastrophic fall in terms of inflation. The counter-ISIS coalition and the US Department of Defense is increasingly concerned because we rely, not legally, but sort of gentleman's agreement, we rely on the backing of the likes of Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and others to keep military troops deployed in northeastern Syria. But we now have the Saudis, the Iraqis, the Jordanians, the Emiratis, and others on paper in written communiques advocating for the withdrawal of occupation troops, i.e. us and the Turks. That is a magnitude shift in terms of how the region is presenting our deployment in northeastern Syria to counter ISIS. The counter-ISIS ministerial in Riyadh just a couple of months ago or so has received the lowest level of counter-ISIS funding ever. The Saudis didn't bail up a single US dollar. The Emiratis, record low numbers in terms of donations too. So we're now less than 50% funded for the next calendar year of counter-ISIS operations in Syria and Iraq. The SDF, our local partners, have their position on the ground vis-a-vis Damascus, vis-a-vis Turkey has been just significantly undermined. And of course, all the spoilers have been empowered. So we've seen record levels of Russian brinkmanship. Multiple times per day, Russian jets are flying over American positions. That happened when I was in northeastern Syria with the CENTCOM commander. A Russian jet flew right over us. I mean, nobody would have thought even 6 months ago that the Russians would have been bold enough to do that. And then most significantly on this ISIS issue, ISIS is surging in only one area of the Middle East right now, and that is in regime-held areas of Syria. April was ISIS's deadliest and most aggressive month since it was a territorial state in regime-held areas. They defeated a 6-week Russian Air Force, Russian ground forces, Wagner Group, Iranian proxy militia, Syrian army, and National Defense Force counteroffensive in central Syria. ISIS won. They just have a few cells in the desert, and they beat that enormous force. So from a counter-ISIS perspective, it's only bad news. The Captagon trade, we've seen an expanded scope geographically of seizures and movement of drugs from Syria since normalization began. And we've also seen, despite much European skepticism of Captagon's relative importance, the discovery of a production center in Germany with roughly $25 million worth of Captagon already in this production site and over 2.5 tons of precursor chemicals. So now this has become a European issue. On refugees, we've seen the worst polling from Syrian refugees ever in terms of their willingness to ever return to a Syria controlled by the Assad regime. UN polling shows that is now only at 1% of Syrians ever being interested. We've seen escalation in Idlib in the northwest militarily, and we've seen escalation in Daraa in the south. The cross-border aid mechanism is now essentially dead. There have been no political prisoners released. The Assad regime has communicated to the UN in private meetings that it has no plans to engage with the Constitutional Committee or in any step-for-step process. So if we list all of those things down, where's the good news? Where has the region accomplished anything
This is the
by
worst list
engaging
ever.
with the regime?
Yeah.
And so that is why there's supposed to be a regional summit that was supposed to follow up on progress on re-engagement with the regime. That whole summit is now up in the air because there's nothing to talk about except bad news. And that's no secret within regional capitals. And there is a great deal of frustration, no surprises to any of us who were rightly skeptical of whether this was going to work. But that's where we are. The region has scored a horrific own goal, undermined everybody's leverage to meaningfully resolve anything in Syria. And this is what they have to shout about.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Charles. I mean, it's this list, as you said, like this is the worst news ever on anyone could hear. Ala, I want to turn to you on this same issue. I think as as Syrians, and we understand, I think the administration, the Biden administration has been for long promoting, in a way, in a sense, the sense of stability in the region. They've been trying to achieve a ceasefire in Yemen, a ceasefire in Syria, normalization between Arab countries and Israel. Considering this kind of like a news list that Charles mentioned, cross-border mechanism is not in place anymore, no more detainees, constitutional committee is not being held. The regime is even refusing for the constitutional committee to be held in any Arab capital, including like with allied countries to the regime. Inflation going high, potential escalation in Idlib. How does, I mean, from anyone just, stepping outside, this is kind of like a disaster recipe in 3 months for any stability conditions in the region. How do Syrians actually see kind of like the sense of stability that the administration maybe is talking about? And what do you think needs to be done to kind of like reverse course on this bad news list in the last 3 months?
So I'm glad that you asked me specifically about U.S. policy, and I'm also glad that my colleague Charles, set up the overall picture for us in terms of the administration's approach to the Middle East. I'd like to just zoom in a little bit more on Syria and see what happened, and also answer the question why normalization is happening on the scale, and is it bringing about stability or not? So we detected a shift in U.S. policy in 2020, towards the end of 2021, 2022. To make a long story short, the U.S. position on Syria, especially on normalization with the Assad regime, shifted from the United States is not going to normalize ties with Bashar al-Assad. And if you're an ally of ours, and should you normalize ties with a reprehensible genocidal dictator like Bashar al-Assad, well, we have existing sanctions on the books, we have laws, and those laws are going to be enforced. So that used to be the policy. Now, the shift that happened can be described as we are not going to normalize relations. The United States is not going to normalize relations with the Bashar al-Assad regime. But if you're an ally of ours, if you're an Arab country, if you are a Gulf country, and you would like to do business again with Bashar al-Assad, that's none of our business. And maybe while at it, get something for it. So this aspect of transactionality was introduced. And again, as Charles said, the approach or the theory or the ratiocination, it was that maybe this has gone on for far too long, and maybe this way we can stabilize things. And sadly, we've seen this movie before, because quote unquote a realistic approach was also pursued vis-a-vis Syria under the Obama administration. And that did not bring about stability. It actually brought about massive, massive global crises in terms of terrorism, in terms of refugees, in terms of drugs. So I see the administration's approach as it's a low-cost approach that is honestly based on, I would say, wishful thinking. Hoping that slapping some band-aids would reduce the temperature, would maybe calm things down a little bit. And as Charles mentioned, things are headed in the opposite direction. Of course, we are not surprised because when you're communicating to the regime, when your message to the regime is that you can be forgiven despite the genocide that you've committed, you can be forgiven despite hundreds of thousands of killed in the most reprehensible, the most gruesome manner, then what incentive are you giving Bashar al-Assad in order to grant any concessions? So we basically, the Assad regime was welcomed back into the Arab League without making any meaningful concessions, without releasing detainees, without cooperating on a political solution. And instead of the regime, because the theory also, some of these countries, when they came to Washington, D.C. and advocated this approach, they said, maybe we can secure concessions from the regime if we engage with Damascus. If we don't engage with Damascus, then Damascus or the regime will be completely under the sway of Iran. And lo and behold, instead of the regime becoming more malleable or more flexible, the regime is becoming more intransigent, because the regime can have its cake and eat it at the same time. They have Iran, they have Russia, And now they have support from Arab countries without making any concessions. So that is the main issue. And I would also like to note to you and to your viewers is that we monitor events on the ground in Syria on a daily basis. And for the past few months, we have observed almost weekly buildup of forces near Aleppo. And honestly, that portends very, very badly because this can only be a harbinger of a potentially bloody offensive, similar to the offensive, the assault that we saw end of 2019, beginning in 2020, when 1 million Syrians were displaced to the border region. So we're also, we wouldn't be surprised if a new refugee crisis of epic proportions happened, because the regime made it very clear. Bashar al-Assad went on national TV and said, I would like to recapture every single inch of territory we lost. So the regime communicated its intentions. The regime's intentions are clear, but I think we are, turning a blind eye, or we're pretending that this is not happening because we're hoping that maybe a low-cost approach, a band-aid would stabilize a situation as explosive as Syria. The final thing I'll say is that I would also recommend looking at the southern Syria, at Dar'a, the province in southern Syria, as a microcosm. I mean, it's a big province. It's not so much. It's not a microcosm, but I would recommend looking at it as an example of what happens when Bashar al-Assad is given control again of a province. So a few years ago, the regime regained control of Dar'a, and frankly, this did not happen solely because of Russian support or Iranian support. It also happened because the United States cut off support to the rebels in the south. The largest moderate secular rebel coalition was in southern Syria. So they were the support to them was cut off, and the hope was that maybe the south will be stabilized. Instead, Dar'a now is one of the most restive regions in Syria. The regime now is using Dar'a as a gateway for smuggling, flooding the whole region with Captagon, Jordan, Saudi, United Arab Emirates. And there are daily reports of assassinations and counter-assassinations and clashes and protests in Dar'a. So clearly, Bashar al-Assad regaining control of Dar'a did not stabilize it. It actually turned it into its portal for flooding the region and the world with Captagon. So there is no reason to believe that giving Bashar al-Assad control again over all of Syria would help at all.
So how can building on that situation, clearly again, the current track is not working. As Charles mentioned, the Arab Small Group is meeting August 16th, I believe, to follow up on the Amman communique to see what the regime has achieved. No one is optimistic, as far as I know, about what the regime has achieved. It's clearly the regime didn't deliver anything. Actually, to the opposite, they've been able to deliver worse results than what was already expected. Considering all of that, what could the Biden administration do? We know, like, on the Hill, there are efforts, again, with the Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act. There has been different versions. There is now the House version. The Senate version was introduced yesterday. There has been efforts to include it in the National Defense Authorization Act. So there is clearly a lot happening on the Congress side. But I don't know if do you think there is much happening on the administration side? And if not, what could the Biden administration do to change this course?
So I think that the administration has taken notice of all of the momentum that has been building up on Capitol Hill. So they, clearly see these statements coming out from members of Congress on a bipartisan basis, that members of Congress, that basically the direction that we have taken U.S. policy in the past 2 years is not in line with congressional intent, is not in line with the bipartisan will of Congress. So they've seen the Captagon Act. They had to come up with a strategy to counter Captagon. They're seeing now a Senate version also of the House version of the Assad regime Anti-Normalization Act. I would say actually 2 versions. There have been 2 versions just in the past week, 2 versions in the Senate just in the past week. So I think the administration can help. I mean, I have no doubt that they've taken notice of all of this, and I think they're cognizant of the fact that there is pushback against this policy. So in terms of what they could do, I think there's a lot they could do. I think it would all have to start with being cognizant of the fact that the approach, the Biden administration approach to Syria is not working, it's backfiring, and that a major course correction is needed. And then I would reach out to our Arab partners. I would prevail on them, explaining that, especially in light of the killing of the cross-border aid mechanism, because the hope was that they were going to get the regime's consent, or at least Russian cooperation, to renew the cross-border aid for at least a year. That was the hope. And instead, the whole thing was killed. So I would prevail on Arab partners, arguing that this approach is not working, and that we need to go back to isolating the regime. We need to go back to pressuring the regime. And of course, the administration can easily do that by implementing or enforcing U.S. law. So you have the Caesar law that has not been, it's not, I mean, I can't say it's not 100% it's not being enforced, but it's not really being enforced as it should be enforced. And there are a lot of other tools that Congress has provided the administration with, so that what the administration needs to do is to use that leverage instead of undermining the leverage by allowing Arab partners to fully normalize with the regime without the regime changing its behavior whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, on the same level too, Charles. Again, those Arab partners are meeting next month, again with all of this very bad list of increasing refugee flows from Turkey, from Syria. We've seen, like, just earlier today, Poland caught a truck with Syrians trying to go through Turkey. Turkey increased their deportation of refugees into Syria in the last few weeks. Captagon is not only now a regional issue, as you said, a factory was just caught in Germany. Clearly, this is not working, the current approach. What could be done? Again, working with our Arab partners, with the situation we have, and also taking in consideration the challenges we have with both Russia, China, and also Iran, trying to also find their own way with our partners in the Gulf.
So it's kind of the billion-dollar question that there's no easy answer to. I think, first of all, it has to be said, the phrase that people always repeat is there's no magic solution. If the United States suddenly clicked its fingers, then we're not going to fix the crisis like that. But I think the immediate and bluntest start of an answer to you starts with the Biden administration needs to care. I think I and many others have given up with talking in gentle terms about this. If the United States is going to have a meaningful Syria policy, the administration, i.e. the White House, needs to care, needs to acknowledge, and as Mohammed said, be cognizant of the reality that a Syria left alone, or a Syria in which the United States and Europe, for example, are disengaged from, is a Syria that does and will continue to affect international and global stability. I mean, have we learned nothing from 2014 and 2015 when the refugee wave that emanated primarily from Syria completely transformed international politics? I mean, it transformed politics in the United States. Anti-refugee sentiment has a direct correlation with the rise of far-right populist politics here in the US, divisions within the European Union, Brexit, the rise of populism in Central and Southern Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the war in Ukraine. Have we learned nothing by continuing to hear the same phrase from Biden administration officials that, well, listen, when it comes to it, Syria is just peripheral to American interests. It's never mattered and it's not going to matter in the future. This kind of blindness to what's happened in Syria and emanating from Syria over the past 12 years, continues to baffle me. Yes, it is a damn difficult crisis to ever resolve, and we should all recognize that. There is no magic solution. But if we're going to do anything meaningful, it just starts with caring about what's happening there. And Mohammed very rightly brought up the example of Daraa. There are very senior American officials in the Biden administration who, quite frankly, were the architects of what happened in Daraa. They didn't just cut off support to the Southern Front. They negotiated the deal that resulted in the regime's takeover of Daraa. We, and this administration, frankly, because there are the highest level people running Middle East policy, were the ones who negotiated that Daraa deal around the table in Jordan and then forced the Southern Front to give up their arms. Have we learned nothing from Daraa? It is, and has been for 3 years, the most consistently unstable area in all of Syria. So the idea that, quote unquote, reconciliation deals are the solution is a fantasy. And those very same senior US officials still envision a reconciliation-style deal between the SDF and Damascus in northeastern Syria. That is still the framework that this administration's highest-level Middle East officials believe will be eventually the solution for an American withdrawal from northeastern Syria if and when those conditions are right. And speaking of the Northeast, if there's one thing that the Biden administration in terms of foreign policy is most sensitive about, it's what happened in Afghanistan. Well, I tell you what, if we're going to see an Afghanistan 2.0 repeat itself, we are slow walking in that direction in northeastern Syria, because we haven't cared, we haven't invested, and we've allowed others in the region to take stupid steps that have only backfired and have further undermined our leverage and our influence. And we have relied within the SDF on a certain faction within the SDF, led by Mazloum, who is loyal to the United States and who is willing to forego and deal with problematic aspects of American politics and what have you. Well, his influence within the SDF is dwindling because of our inaction and because of the normalization developments. And the longer that continues, the less sort of tangible and sustainable our military presence in the Northeast is going to become. And if the Biden administration cares most about domestic politics and its re-election chances, well, repeating Afghanistan in northeastern Syria is going to be really, really bad. And let's not also forget those very same Middle East officials within the administration were the architects of the withdrawal from Iraq in 2010 and 11, and that didn't go particularly well either. It resulted in the biggest terrorist organization the world has ever seen. So it comes down to caring, it comes down to matching words with action, not just words. And it should come down, let's not be diplomatic about it, it should come down to abiding by US law. The Caesar Act is US law, it's not a policy, it's not something you pick and choose, it is US law, and it hasn't been abided by this administration. And there have been quiet efforts by the Treasury Department to crack down quietly on sanctions evasion in certain Gulf countries over the last couple of years, but no serious measures apart from quiet visits to say, please stop doing what you're doing, violating the Caesar Act. What else to say? The Captagon Act and the Captagon strategy was, I think, an important symbolic development, but when you read the Captagon strategy, there's nothing new in there. We've been doing that for the past 5 years. So from the administration's standpoint, they just got to write down what they think they're already doing and then say, we've ticked that box, we've pleased the Syrian American community, we've done what we needed to do, now let's move on and think about Ukraine and China. So there has to be a realization that more is necessary. And the last thing I would say to underline that is a status quo approach or a containment approach, which basically defines the administration's approach, is insufficient. I mean, we ought to see that. We cannot sustain the status quo by putting band-aids over refugee issues, by trying to negotiate every now and then with the Russians to sustain cross-border aid. It's not working. Our leverage is being reduced every month. And again, if they acknowledged the significance of what Syria can represent if it continues to deteriorate, they would acknowledge as the administration that that status quo approach, that hands-off approach, isn't going to work. But frankly, we're not there yet. So what we can continue to do is shout from the rooftops and list off all of the bad news and show how everything's getting worse as a result of the current approach. But I wouldn't say I'm particularly confident that this administration is going to wake up to any of those, any of those facts that are on the table.
I mean, you mentioned the status quo, and it is indeed, I think, the policy of everyone, whether it is the United States, Russia, Turkey, it is to deal with the status quo. I think in a more American term, one American diplomat used, basically the policy is if you touch it, you own it. We are in the Northeast, so our main concern is Northeast. Turkey has to deal with Northwest because they're in Northwest, and then Russia and Iran has to deal with the rest of Syria since they are there. In terms of our leverage then in northern Syria, and that is in northeast, and also our kind of like lost leverage in northwest with Turkey being there, what do you think could be done more in the north from the United States perspective in northeast, but also it could be done more with Turkey in northwest Syria? Again, this is the only area of leverage we have with NATO member countries having, combined between, the United States have around 2,500 forces there, and Turkey has, there's no official number, but between 40 and 50,000 troops in Northwest. What could be done realistically, again, considering all of the challenges we have? What are the opportunities that we have in northern Syria that we can realistically say the Biden administration, a future administration, can actually put in place to kind of like stop this train of bad news from moving forward?
So to start answering your question, I'll lay out a broad series of facts that I don't think get the acknowledgement that they deserve, which is, again, in answer to comments we frequently hear from the administration in private circles, which is, well, the war in Syria is over. The question is just how it resolves itself. Assad has won. That's never going to change. Now, I wrote an article years ago saying Assad hasn't won, and I made that argument all the way back then. I think that's even clearer now than it was back then. The threat to the regime was never really a military one. The regime always knew that it had the likes of Russia and Iran who would militarily back it to the brink if necessary. The real threat to the regime is economic. The regime's, the absolute collapse of the Syrian economy is, I think, the existential threat that the regime is most afraid of, because it has no allies who will come to back it out of that crisis. So when you speak of leverage, yes, our direct and indirect control or influence over territory in the north and the northeast is very significant, absolutely no question about that. But we do also have that hold over, potentially, the ability of the Syrian economy to recover, for aid funds and rebuilding funds to come into the country. We hold that switch as a result of the regime's 12 years of crimes. And I would say that's our biggest leverage, together with partners in the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada, who also have sanctions in place for the regime's war crimes. But in terms of the north, I would say we also need to recognize that there is, if you count all Syrians, refugees along the border and Syrians in country, the regime only governs, quote unquote, about 50% of Syrian people. So again, the idea that it's won is a myth. The idea that people are flooding back to regime-held areas because the crisis is over is a myth. Refugees are not going to return to a regime-held Syria either. So that whole basis for saying, well, we can handle things from afar, but eventually Syria will resolve itself is completely inaccurate. But in terms of the north, we need to recognize that the control, direct and indirect, of that territory does offer significant leverage. But the way that we have been directly and indirectly controlling or supporting that territory doesn't. And that's why I wrote a paper called Freeze and Build, whatever that was, 18 months ago, which was, we've spent so much money, and the United States is still the single biggest aid donor to Syria. We've spent so much money on providing emergency assistance to an area of Syria all across the north where conflict lines have been frozen for 3 years. So in other words, we're still providing, broad terms, food baskets, emergency aid, and tents to an area that has, yes, still hit periodically by artillery strikes by the regime, but is more or less stable in comparison to 2011 to 2019. That doesn't make any sense. It's expensive to provide emergency assistance. It's resource intensive. What we should be doing is providing more strategic assistance, early recovery, stabilization, limited and targeted reconstruction in those areas. That kind of assistance is strategic. If we want to talk about status quo or containment, if we're concerned about refugee waves, we're not going to fix that by providing food baskets and tents. We are going to fix that by investing in those local communities and allowing those communities to support themselves sometime down the line. If we're ever going to believe in the Northeast and the Northwest coming back together again, the easiest way of doing that isn't to try to bring two warring sides around the table. It's to introduce a dynamic where intercommunal trade becomes more of a realistic prospect, because those local communities are supporting themselves. They are able to establish their own local businesses and trade. And if they want to continue to build that, they will have to trade across into the Northeast. HTS trades into the regime-held areas. There's no reason why there can't be more trade between the Northeast and the Northwest. So it's sort of a no-brainer from the outside, but it does take, or it would take, a paradigm shift in terms of how we provide assistance into the Northwest. And maybe the only the only maybe good thing to come out of the end of the cross-border mandate is this is our opportunity to finally do that paradigm shift. There are individual countries, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, the Turks, who do a lot of this work unilaterally already, investing into local communities, building semi-permanent residential structures to take people away from tents. But if that was an international multilateral effort, I can't explain enough how transformative that would be and beneficial to our prospects of further stabilizing that region and building those links that we've all long wanted, but we've tried the hardest thing to dialogue to try and fix.
Perfect. Ala, on the same question as well, what could be done more in northern Syria as a
one key recommendation or one key ask that we have had or we have been pushing on both on the Hill and with the administration is exactly or precisely what Charles just talked about. That is stabilization funding to northern Syria, specifically northwest Syria. So this is the region that is, just for the benefit of your viewers, this is the region that is hardest hit, that was hardest hit by the earthquake. And this is also the region that's practically besieged by the regime. So their only outlet into the world is mainly, maybe I shouldn't say the only one, but it's mainly Turkey. And they're extremely reliant or almost totally reliant on Turkey. So that's where we get the cross-border aid through Turkey to that region. So as Charles mentioned, first of all, the cross-border aid mechanism was killed by the Russians very recently. And we have long advocated for an alternative. So we've always said, especially in light of the earthquake, when the earthquake happened, the United Nations was nowhere to be seen for almost 8 days. And millions of, this is a region that has over 4 million people. They were they were seething with anger at the United Nations, and they flew UN flags upside down. They flew them inverted to express their disapproval of the fact that the UN was nowhere to be seen. So we said that there should be less reliant. We're not saying we should completely obviate the UN system, but there should be less reliance on the UN system because it clearly has failed and because it's also beholden to this reauthorization at the Security Council that Russia has taken hostage in order to extract more concessions from the Europeans and from the United States. So on that front, on the front of humanitarian assistance, there's a fund. There's currently a fund, and this fund we need to be pumping more money. And frankly, some of the money that we've been sending through the United Nations into that fund, because this fund should utilize localized aid, should utilize Syrian diaspora groups, humanitarian groups, local groups that have proven to be effective and reliable over the past 10 years, that have the connections, that have the networks, and that can spare us this completely failed and broken down process at the Security Council. So that's on the humanitarian assistance front. And then we're saying exactly what Charles said. So we've been doing this for years. You can't basically continue to give people food baskets forever and keep them poor forever. The solution is to allocate stabilization funding for that region. And it can be small. It can be 100 million, we can start with 100 million, we can start with 150 million, which is loose change in comparison with how much the United States is investing to deal with ramifications of the vulnerability of that population. So the United States over the past few years has sent about 150 to 160 million on an annual basis to the Northeast region by way of stabilization funding, but nothing to the Northwest region. Again, that's where you have over 4 million people. That's the region hardest hit by the earthquake. That's a region that's in crosshairs of the regime, that the regime targets with bombing. And if there's a new offensive, if there's a potentially new offensive, it's going to be against that corner of the country. But you also have opportunities in that region. That's where you have civil society activists. That's where you have people pushing back against extremist groups. That's where you have an extremist group that would like to be seeded a population in the millions of people so they can have their own statelet. So if you think about it from a purely cynical counterterrorism perspective, it makes sense to invest in stabilization. If you think about it from the cynical perspective of we want to save money we're giving to humanitarian assistance, this would save you money. And if you would like to address the refugee crisis, you would be helping people, remain resilient and stay in their homes. It's a no-brainer. So this is a key ask. The other ask, and that's also to the point, to Charles's point of the administration has to care. What does the expression of care look like in real life?
Yeah.
When when the previous administration left, we had senior diplomats working the Syria file. People like Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who were very senior, and were able to fight these bureaucratic battles. They were able to maneuver, to speak with, to do effective diplomacy with Arab countries. And when they left, they were not replaced. Okay, so that is clearly something that the administration can do instead of, frankly, the file being run strictly out of the White House. The White House is busy, and folks at the White House are responsible for Iraq and Syria and Yemen and a bunch of other countries. We need to have senior American diplomats to empower them to deal with this litany of woes, this bad list or this litany of woes that Charles mentioned. You can't do that unless you have the human resources, and at the moment we don't.
Yeah, I mean, I want to turn some questions from the audience online and also from the audience here. Again, if you have any question, please go to askac.org. But the one final thing, what you mentioned about stabilization, I think there's one elephant in the room here that is usually ignored is what do we do with Turkey? Our bilateral relations with Turkey has been a mess for almost a decade now, close to a decade. I remember when General License 22 was issued in 2020, in June of 2021, U.S. Officials were reaching out to businessmen in the diaspora, asking them to utilize General License 22 and go invest in the Northeast. And Turkish officials were reaching out to the same business people in the diaspora, asking them to not invest in areas of the Northeast. So clearly, again, in a major step like General License 22, which provides a leverage, again, a general umbrella of exemption from sanctions for areas in both Northeast and Northwest, it appears there was zero coordination between the US and United States and Turkey over implementing that. How can we kind of I've spoken to different US officials and I always told them we need to solve this divorce. And they keep telling me, no, it's more of a disagreement than a divorce. But again, looking at the last decade, I mean, we've had some good news in the last couple of weeks with, on NATO, on Ukraine, which some people say even, Russia is sacrificing the cross-border, the grain deal because of what happened with NATO. But yeah, we haven't seen really any step forward between the US and Turkey on how to deal with northern Syria. Specifically, what can the Biden administration do with Turkey to deal with the situation in the north? I'll start with Charles and then I'll turn to you. I know it's not an easy question.
This is the hardest question of all because we've been asking it for so many years and repeatedly coming up short. I think the problem is, I mean, so to your example, before the general license that you were talking about was introduced, there were senior US delegations who went to Ankara to talk about this before it was announced. So, I mean, this is more problematic. It wasn't that there was no dialogue, there was dialogue, and even after that, the disagreements were as severe as you could have imagined. So I think that comes down to one simple reality, which is that given the security concerns in Turkey and given our belief in the SDF being a perfect, kind of unquestionable force, we're speaking in like opposite directions. We're speaking different languages. The Turks and the Americans continue to speak against each other. And, folks like myself, see it when we speak in conferences and we're brought into, multilateral government conferences and we make comments. The American official will make some remarks and stand up for the SDF without acknowledging any of Turkey's concerns. And then the Turkish official will come up with some pre-prepared remarks and speak about how the SDF is a terrorist organization, but acknowledge none of the American concerns. So the problem is really simple, which is actually just beginning to acknowledge that each other has reasons to be either concerned or invested or otherwise in these issues. Forcing the SDF to announce that they're not the PKK and to rid themselves of PKK cadres has been tried many times by the US military in the Northeast, but it's not going to happen. The PKK cadres do hold significant sway in the Northeast, and they're not all going to leave. And the developments we started out talking about here in terms of regional normalization have empowered those cadres like never before. So we're not going to be able to ever promise Turkey that that PKK influence is going to disappear. But are there other ways that we can try to sort of offer security guarantees? I always forget what it was called, the Manbij deal, the Manbij mechanism, has been maligned for so many years. But I actually think that was the closest we got to a civil-military bilateral arrangement that was aimed at building confidence. Having Turkish troops on American helicopters flying over northeastern Syria was pretty remarkable, but it's starting initiatives like that start to build trust and break down the barriers. But we've slammed that as a complete failure, in large part because it did end up breaking up and the Turks ended up launching an incursion. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try it again and maybe build on it with other forms of security guarantees. And yes, that it would necessitate putting the SDF under some pressure, not to vacate territory along the parts of the northern border, but perhaps for the SDF to vacate and allow other subsidiary forces to be there in place. These kinds of arrangements are big asks, but we're not going to fix the problem with Turkey unless we're willing to give them a try. And then on Turkey's side, they need to acknowledge that they are and remain sort of almost existentially reliant on the likes of the United States and Europe for funding, whether it be the funding that encourages Turkey to stop refugee flows into Europe or humanitarian funding. And with the end of the cross-border mandate, we have leverage in vis-a-vis Ankara like we haven't had in quite some time to say that if you are most concerned about the catastrophic destabilization of northwestern Syria as a result of a reduction in UN aid supplies, we are your sort of saviors. We are the biggest donors to that aid fund. And if there's going to be an arrangement that replaces it, we're going to be the ones that back it up. So we have some opportunities here out of a very bad situation, but we've got to be bold and give them a try rather than just sort of cynically dismiss them as having failed or being impossible.
I completely agree with Charles. This is a very thorny question. But let me start with what our community believes should be a fundamental realization. So yes, the Turkish-American relationship has not been great, to put it very euphemistically. But I would say that Turkey and the United States have been able to work together on a number of very important, issues of extreme importance to both parties. So, for example, Turkey has proven to be very instrumental or very important, at least very relevant, as far as the conflict in Ukraine is concerned. And the United States has been able to work with Turkey on, Turkey played a role of facilitator of the grain deal. Turkey provided the Ukrainians with drones. The United States also needed Turkey's support for Sweden's membership. So clearly, despite all these issues, Turkey and the United States seem to be capable of working together on issues of mutual importance. So what we're saying as Syrians is that Syrians should not be the only exception. We should not be thrown under the bus. And Syrians shouldn't be the only one, we should not be the exception to this rule. You guys can, work out your differences and come together and work on issues of mutual importance. And Syria, Syria should be top of this list, because if you can do that in Syria, then you would help stabilize or like you would help address a number of key issues. So that's number one. I would start with that fundamental realization. And then I would say, since this has been also going on for a long time, to be frank, I mean, I don't think that Turkey is ever going to come on board with SDF. SDF, or the YPG that was rebranded into SDF, was supposed to be, so as Charles said, the United States had very legitimate concerns. So you had you had ISIS, and ISIS needed to be addressed. And the United States looked for, and this is something I was very much involved with, the United States looked for a force in Syria they could work with, that was the Obama administration, they could work with to address the threat from ISIS without getting involved in the Syrian conflict with Bashar al-Assad. So the Syrian opposition was at war with Bashar al-Assad, okay? And so they located this group conveniently because they were not at war with Bashar al-Assad, they were not an opposition group. And they had territorial ambition, so that's how the relationship came about. Now, of course, it was very clear to all of us here that long-term this is going to pose very serious challenges, because forget Turkey. I mean, Turkey is one key actor, but you have Iraqi Kurdistan, you have the Syrian opposition, you have majority Arab communities that this group took over. So all around, you have actually the Syrian Kurdish opposition. That's a Kurdish National Council. They're all not at peace with this group. Okay, so but again, the decision was made that the short-term imperative of fighting ISIS, not getting entangled in the conflict with Bashar al-Assad was a priority. And now I think there's a price to pay. So, but I completely agree with Charles. I think Turkey also has to recognize that the United States isn't going to sit around and do nothing as a transnational terror threat such as ISIS metastasizes. So both parties, as Charles said, both parties have to recognize that they have legitimate concerns. But I would say at the root cause of the issue is that a decision was made to prioritize a short-term imperative without really paying enough attention to what this would mean.
What was supposed to be temporary, transactional, and tactical relationship.
And now short-term, in terms of what the U.S. can do now, I would say the main reason why SDF stands as a force, again, given the very hostile environment vis-a-vis SDF, is thanks to U.S. protection, umbrella of protection, and thanks to U.S. support. And so the U.S. has a lot of leverage. Of course, every time you talk to U.S. officials, we don't have a lot of leverage, which makes zero sense. It makes zero sense to me. The United States has a lot of leverage, and there's a lot of things that the SDF can help in order to alleviate the concerns of not just Turkey, but everyone involved. So, for example, they're shoving down a curriculum down the throats of the population, and Kurds and Arabs are not very enamored with this curriculum. So that's something that the U.S. can say, hey, you don't have that. You need legitimacy. You need local legitimacy. You need to win over local populations. So the U.S. can do some things now, but eventually, in terms of like a solution to this crisis, I don't think the neighbors are ever going to come on board with SDF unless SDF undergoes major transformation.
Or local communities.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to get some of the questions we got. I'll start with you, Ala. We got a question on Captagon and countering Captagon in the region. Do you foresee an opportunity for collaboration between the U.S. and GCC countries on countering Captagon as the main, basically, tool that is financing the Assad regime apparatus today?
So the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, they're the #1 target for the Captagon trade that emanates from regime-controlled territories in Syria. So they definitely need to be involved. And if you look at the strategy that was mandated by Congress, Congress mandated actually cooperation with law enforcement agencies and with these countries on combating that threat. Now, what complicates the situation is that it's very well known to everyone that Bashar al-Assad, specifically Maher al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's brother, they're leading this trade. They're in charge of this trade. So how can we cooperate with these countries on combating this trade while these countries at the same time are advocating for the lifting of sanctions on Bashar al-Assad and integration of Bashar al-Assad and normalization with Bashar al-Assad? So I think that's the tough nut to crack. But I don't think you can do it unless you have these countries on board. Because keep in mind, at least for the time being, I mean, the Captagon is being internationalized, okay, especially with the recent bust in Germany. And I think it's only a matter of time before it reaches U.S. shores. And I would say, based on my conversations with lawmakers, American lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, are keenly aware of this. That's only a matter of time before it reaches U.S. shores. But for now, at least, the Gulf is the key destination for this trade. And so working with them is imperative.
I mean, there is, and I want you to answer that because there is collaboration, it seems, on countering Captagon as an organized crime, but there hasn't been anything done politically, let's say, to address, because Captagon is not only an organized crime issue, it is a political issue as the main source of funding for the Assad regime.
Yeah, well, I think just to sort of piggyback on Mohammed's comments, I think it's important also, again, I think lots of my questions have started by saying we have to go back to something, but there is a kind of key difference here, which is that American officials or American representatives who want to deal with the Captagon issue want to deal with it by seeing the regime in an adversarial frame, like, i.e., Maher al-Assad is the architect of the Captagon trade. Therefore, to break down the Captagon trade, we've got to go after the regime. The region takes a very different, earlier I described the Biden administration's approach to the Middle East as cold and realist. The region's approach to the Captagon trade is cold and realist, and it is, and I've heard this from the officials, which is they're very well aware of how this Syrian regime operates. They are very well aware that from 2003 to 2010, the Syrian regime weaponized something else. Back then it wasn't drugs, but they weaponized jihadists. They weaponized jihadists and sent them to Iraq to kill American troops highly effectively. They had training camps on Syrian territory run by Syrian military intelligence that were training al-Qaeda in Iraq, suicide bombers. 95% of AQI suicide bombers that attacked American troops came from Syria with Syrian training, bussed in Syrian government buses to the Iraqi border. I could go into that in detail.
They were bussed from outside the U.S. embassy in Damascus.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, exactly. So that we could watch them arrive and watch them depart. But the region knows this history. And they're quite open in private meetings to say, listen, we know how the regime operates. The regime has in the UK we call it a tap, in America a faucet. We have a faucet and we turn it up and they turn it down. The regime knows that it can create something, weaponize it, and use it as leverage. We know this is how they work. Captagon is the new jihadists. And we believe in the region the only way to deal with this is to engage the regime and convince it to turn the tap down with incentives to point it in another direction. So the reason I describe this is it's a diametrically opposite approach to how we see it. And I heard it very recently from an Iraqi general who said, years and years ago, I was facing down those AQI suicide bombers that the Syrian regime was dispatching to kill us and American troops. Even despite the fact that I, an Iraqi general, know that this is how the Syrian regime operates, I, an Iraqi general, now believe that the best approach to fixing Syria is to engage with the Syrian regime. We have to deal with in the same way as the regime does. We've got to get our hands dirty, we've got to grit our teeth, and we've got to hope that something good comes out of it. So this is how the region now looks at it. And I don't know if we're going to convince them to do an about turn and perceive the Captagon trade as something that they have to deal with adversarially instead. I think it's too late for that. In an ideal world, yes, we would be encouraging them to do exactly that, with a regional coalition that shares intelligence and information about the networks, about the trade directions, the routes being used. But we're not there anymore. They've already engaged the regime and said, we know you're running this, but we expect you to turn it down. And in exchange, we will, in their words, convince the Americans to drop sanctions. We'll convince the UN to give you concessions in a step-for-step process. So we're talking two completely different languages, and I fear it's too late to switch that around. That now doesn't mean that we should stop doing what we're doing from the outside, because the regional effort will fail. They are the losing side in that equation. They have no leverage, but I don't see them stopping their approach.
Can I just quickly add?
Yeah.
I'm aware that a regional head of state that is deeply impacted by the regime's Captagon trade privately said the Assad regime will not stop the production of Captagon unless, quote, it's paid the right price.
Right.
So that's your point about the approach they're taking. Now, I would argue that maybe for the time being, yes, that's the approach they want to take. But I believe that this track is going to spectacularly fail. How do I know that? I have 53 years of data to draw on as far as the Assad regime is concerned. You know, they came to power in 1970. We're in 2023. By the time I think Arab countries realize that this track is not going to work, I'd probably be 2024. And I think then the United States will have an opportunity, should it care enough to seize it, in order to, again, lead once again, not just on Captagon and other issues, but especially Captagon, and say, hey, you know, we've tried this, it didn't work, we need a new approach.
Yeah. I mean, again, we've seen, I think recently we've seen like a more recent example of that, as Charles mentioned, you know, Saudi in the region normalized with the regime in 2006 after the regime killed Rafiq Hariri, the prime minister in Lebanon. And we wanted basically, like the region wanted to normalize with Assad to, you know, stop the jihadist faucet, as you mentioned it, and stabilize Lebanon. We've seen the EU normalizing 2 years after, I think Sarkozy visited Syria in 2008, and then the US, you know, reassigned an ambassador, Ambassador Robert Ford at the time, in 2010. Yet in 2011, like just a year after that, the uprising started. Assad went back to his old ways, not only weaponizing jihadists, using chemical weapons, and then going, you know, establishing a new faucet, Captagon, which we see the impact of today. One final question related to Northeast. Charles, how do you see normalization impacting the status of the autonomous administration in Northeast, and what could the U.S. do? I think you kind of like answered that on what the U.S. can do to support the rights of populations in the North, but if you want to expand also on that a little bit.
Well, I think I think Mohammed's description of the SDF, or at the time the YPG, as not an opposition group is entirely accurate. They are sort of qualitatively different in terms of how they view the regime. They view the regime as a rival rather than as an enemy. But when it comes to the question of how do they view normalization, the impact is very much still the same. They feel undermined by regional steps to normalize the regime because their negotiating position has got significantly weaker. And the sort of wing of the SDF or the wing of the YPG that we have relied upon the most in terms of leadership positions, in terms of influence across the SDF structure, have seen their position within the SDF significantly weakened. We've seen publicly from the PKK in Kandil in northern Iraq beginning to speak publicly about the need for a deal with Damascus and the fact that the negotiation track has to be the one that is pursued. And we saw an announcement from the autonomous administration right after the Arab League summit saying that now is the time to begin negotiating. We acknowledge there has to be a deal. None of those things are coincidences. They are as a result of a perception that regime normalization weakens us as the SDF. We are going to have no choice but to make a deal. They are all, whether they are in the wing that wants to negotiate or the wing that doesn't believe it's going to, bring anything good, they both believe it's not going to be good. because they don't have the leverage, and because the United States is not going to sit at the table and negotiate this, because we don't frankly have the leverage, because once there's a deal, we're out. And so there is, I think, a great deal of concern across the SDF about what all of this means. But I do think that eventually it will mean that there will be this quiet resumption of engagement with Damascus. And it will probably mean that the SDF eventually it will be a Daras-style reconciliation deal, whereby the SDF is granted some element of military autonomy in their region, but governance is run through Damascus. From a US perspective, the counter-ISIS campaign will basically be finished in terms of Syria, and ISIS will be laughing. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is, out of the whole regional normalization track we've seen over the last 3 months, the only people cheering it on are Assad, Russia, Iran, and ISIS. ISIS has the most to benefit from this, because the regime isn't going to see sanctions lifted. The Russians and the Iranians aren't going to suddenly have some wonderful environment to operate in Syria. But ISIS is going to be able to exploit the many long-term knock-on effects that regime normalization will bring. And that is something that I don't think has been nearly enough acknowledged within this administration. I know the DoD is completely panicked about it. They realize that their timetable of remaining in Syria is now probably on a clock. There has been no decision within the administration to order a withdrawal, but there has been an instruction given to plan what a withdrawal would look like in 2023, 2024, this kind of time frame. That's not a plan to do it, but it is obviously a recognition that we may have to do this at some point, whether we want to or not. And that in and of itself is significant, and the SDF is not going to be unaware of that either.
Well, then, unless we care and we translate this care into diplomatic engagement, into investing in our own leverage, as you said, Russia, Iran, and ISIS would be really happy about the situation. I want to thank you so much. On that note, Charles Lister, the Director of the Counterterrorism and Syria Programs at the Middle East Institute, and Mohammed Ala Ghanem, the Policy Chief at the Syrian American Council and the American Coalition for Syria. And I want to thank our audience in person here and online. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Qutayba.
Thanks, Qutayba.
Thank you.
Thank you.